Thoughts on Maoism by the Wildcat Journal from Germany, translated into English by AngryWorkersWorld. Thoughts on Maoism. We want to use the opportunity to say a few words about Maoism from our perspective, primarily on an anecdotal level. First of all, we feel it is necessary to explain why are we still talking about Maoism today. Here are some examples of initiatives within our milieu where Maoism has a problematic influence. A few groups within the, quote, base building tendency in the US and perhaps in the UK use Maoist vocabulary and aspects of its ideology. From the actual idea of base building, who is the base and for what, to the call to serve the people, who are the people and why serving them. We understand the impetus of the comrades. Instead of rehashing electoral politics or staying within the bubble of the movement, they suggest to go to the people and deal with their day-to-day problems. Their main framework here is not the working class as a social group that already has a social relationship and collective practice within the work process, but the poor in the territory that need to be joined together in campaigns. We still think that the base building tendency is an interesting development and want to discuss with comrades involved in it. A second current tendency where Maoism plays a role is the regional struggle in Rojava, Kurdistan. Comrades might say that the Maoist days of the PKK are over and that the leadership has embraced libertarian communal theories, but ideological twists and turns, depending on tactical maneuvers, is the prime feature of Maoism. For example, to get off the list of international terrorist organizations, to gamer support from the European and US liberal left and military aid from various states. We understand the urge of comrades to support a regional struggle that proclaims to be internationalist, feminist, and anti-authoritarian. But both personal experience with PKK-related groups, see below, and the devastating historical results of regional liberation struggles for the working class ring our alarm bells. The Wildcat article mentions a few reasons why Maoism seems like an attractive alternative to the old left, in the form of the Communist Party or Social Democratic Party formations. We could mention a few more. There is an anarchistic element in Maoism, the, quote, spontaneous struggle of, quote, the people, and even its often chaotic nature is embraced as a necessary process of collective learning. Revolutionaries, in particular from the middle class, are supposed to, quote, declassify by renouncing their material privileges and their bookish knowledge. They are supposed to first go and live with and listen to the people. The questioning of one's own consciousness encouraged, one's own mind portrayed as a battlefield of reactionary and progressive thoughts and sentiments. Last but not least, Maoism tends to favor the most, quote, most downtrodden, which would be the Afro-American poor in the United States or the indigenous tribal Adivasi population in the Indian jungle areas. There are important elements in all this. The problem is the Maoist misunderstanding of what makes class struggle revolutionary. Many upheavals are initially led by the, quote, marginalized sections of the working class. But without links to the world of production, these upheavals are either smashed or they turn towards alliances with the national, religious, fascist, mafia-type, etc. middle class. Maoism has little understanding of the productive sphere and workers' antagonistic collectivity within, and therefore mirrors the unstable character of their chosen revolutionary subject. They either engage in a suicidal, martyr fetishing cult of violence, or martyr fetishing cult of violence, not murder, martyr, like Jesus. Martyr fetishizing cult of violence, and or form tactical alliances with the enemy force. The challenge is to find organic links between the marginal and core working class. Maoism also intertwines personal and semi-psychological elements of, quote, declassification with ideological justifications for, quote, personal authority and violent parastate structures, which is the perfect mix to create the most vile sex. Remember Brixton? I don't know. That must mean something to people from UK. Some anecdotal experiences with Maoism. In Germany in the 1990s, the PKK and the Maoist Turkish parties were the biggest organizations of the, quote, far left. There were people killed in Berlin when rivaling Maoist organizations fought each other. We had contacts to Kurdish families and supporting them, being attracted by the community spirit and political dedication. Once you saw more of the internal struggles, things were less pretty. In Kurdistan, the PKK stopped land occupations early on in their development in order not to piss off the Kurdish, quote, Kurdish landowners who supported the, quote, national struggle financially. This included Islamic fundamentalists. Comrades told us now they had to attend PKK training camps in Kurdistan as teenagers and were forced to shoot traitors as a form of initiation. The cult around Öcalan was combined with a martyr cult. We attended demos where people tried to set themselves on fire, which was celebrated as an act of heroism. People who were critical of the organization were threatened. Involvement in people and drug smuggling to finance the military actions in Kurdistan seemed more than just, quote, nasty rumors spread by the Turkish state. Together with Turkish-Kurdish comrades, we encourage working-class PKK members to discuss their situations as workers in Germany and to get organized. This was seen as a threat to the PKK and discouraged in all kinds of forms by using moralistic arguments, quote, people are dying back home, end quote, or pointing out that the middle-class elements are needed to finance the organization. A decade later, we met comrades in India who used to be part of the Maoist CPI-ML as the only organization on the left that opposed the state of emergency of the Indira Gandhi government in the 1970s. They told us how they were sent to the countryside to organize the, quote, self-sufficient Adivasi population, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, and the peasantry, only to find out that these had already become wage workers. When they pointed this out to the party bosses and suggested focusing the party efforts on wage workers, they were expelled from the party. Maoism in India split in the late 1970s. One faction focused on building the People's Army in remote areas. Together started focusing on wage workers. In the rural areas, Maoists often build ties with regionalist movements, often leading to violent political infights and massacres. Military warfare needs resources, so the Maoist organizations tax local capitalists and repress strikes of workers of these capitalists because, quote, these capitalists, quote, had already paid their dues, end quote. The military logic and state repression creates a spiral. Each village in certain areas of the so-called, quote, tribal belt is seen as either a, quote, pro-Maoist or, quote, anti-Maoist camp with massacres from both sides. The Maoist organizations have little interest in the urban working poor, but prefer to focus on the liberal middle class as ambassadors of the cause. For them, India is still, quote, semi-feudal, and an alliance with the progressive national bourgeoisie is needed for a democratic revolution. In the urban areas, those factions who decided to focus on the wage working class often display the contradictions of most vanguardist parties. Most of the young comrades are from middle-class backgrounds. The party leaders encourage them to organize workers during their time at university, while they themselves stay in the background in their professional jobs. Various small organizations compete for influence among workers, and they use anti-working class tactics to do so. At JNU University in Delhi, one of the organizations supported construction workers and encouraged an action that would most likely result in victimization because they saw this as, quote, beneficial to the campaign, end quote. And there is a logic as those workers join the organization. And there's a logic as mainly those workers join the organizations who have been sacked and paraded as victims. The organizations support them. In return, the organizations become the organization's, quote, showpiece workers. A lot of these young comrades work tirelessly, but the party's tactics are most likely to wear them out. These are anecdotes, but they fit the overall picture of an opportunistic and essentially authoritarian ideology. Okay, so that was from AngryWorkersWorld. I thought we were starting right out of the gate with the Wildcat article, but I found that this introduction helpful. But I'm just gonna say that was AngryWorkersWorld. Now we're moving on to the Wildcat article, which is called "Maoism is a Poisonous Weed." Wildcat issue number 105, spring 2020. John Lennon knew it. But if you want to carry pictures of Chairman Mao, ain't gonna make it with anyone anyhow. And it's gonna be alright. Oh man, that was my imitation of the song Revolution, which is fucking an amazing song. It's a skate video from my youth, and I've loved it ever since. But, okay, let me redo that without being embarrassing. John Lennon knew it. But if you go carrying pictures of Chairman Mao, you ain't gonna make it with anyone anyhow. Which was recorded at the end of the album Revolution number 9. I knew there was a footnote here. It says, Lennon did not mean the CCP's internal strategy paper of 2012, which warns of Western values and their spread. But this, during the Cultural Revolution, the, quote, 4 black categories, counter-revolutionaries, bad elements, landowners, and rich peasants, were combined with the newly invented category of right-wingers to 5 black elements, end quote. Then old bourgeoisie and pro-capitalists were added, resulting in 8 black elements. The peak was reached when the stinking number 9, traders, agents, and bourgeois intellectuals.
Good morning, Tom.
Good morning. It was my mother, so say hi to my mom. She's a nice lady. Where the fuck was I? Okay, so this is why people murder their parents. I get it now. Then old bourgeoisie and pro-capitalists were added, resulting in 8 black elements. The peak was reached when the stinking number 9, quote, traders, agents, and bourgeois intellectuals was added. Huh. Interesting. God damn it, I lost my spot. Okay. Our, quote, China trilogy in issues 102 to 104 started with a misunderstanding. You could even call it a manipulation. See our explanations in Wildcat 104, page 36. We should have noticed it. In the article about Jasic in the, I guess it says Jasic, Jasic, in the Wildcat 102, the usual fairy tales were told, similar to those you used to read in the German Maoist paper Red Flag, Rote Fahne. Because the vehicle that workers used to move their modest belongings, quote, a borrowed electric tricycle blocked a road, a BMW driver got excited and hit it with a padlock, end quote. Or a worker sees on her way to work in the morning, quote, how a street vendor is badly harassed by the public order office. She immediately intervenes and succeeds in getting his cooking utensils handed over, but she is dragged to a police station for several hours, quote, end quote, and so on. The accompanying pictures of the article were almost Maoist family photos, which clearly revealed the minority character of the actions at Jasic. A very small minority, a group of maybe half a dozen people, starts an action, and shortly afterwards starts collecting signatures in the factory to found a trade union. These are the usual shitty tactics of Maoist vanguard politicians to drag people into their affairs. At no time was this anything like a strike. We had also tried to make direct contact with workers at Jasic. We were denied this as, quote, too dangerous. We shouldn't have called the actions at Jasic a quote, worker struggle in our magazine. The older ones among us are especially hurt because we have been defeated 3 times by the Maoist milieu. In the wake of the strike wave of 1969, many people had the idea that one should, quote, go to the workers, best by going to the factories and working there oneself. The K groups, various Marxist, Leninist, and Maoist parties formed during the 1960s, succeeding in turning this into the distorted image of, quote, factory intervention, with the caricature of the heroic, industrious, blue-collar worker. They started strikes that usually ended badly for the workers involved, just so that they could announce successes in their own party papers and run campaigns for years for the reinstatement of dismissed colleagues. In their expectations of revolution, they lived in a world of their own. In 1975, the Red Army faction lawyer Horst Mahler refused to be released in exchange for Peter Lorenz, who had been kidnapped by the 2nd of June movement because the masses of workers would soon carry him out of prison on their shoulders. At the same time, Horst Mahler was in the Maoist KPD-AO. Horst Mahler later became a prominent fascist. At the end of the 1970s, Maoism defeated us again. Largely out of Mahler's experience of disillusionment, the working masses had not come to his rescue. Instead, the, quote, hero nations of China and Vietnam had waged war against each other. The Green Party was born. Ex-Maoists were at the forefront of the Green Party formation. People such as Tritton, former KB to the Greens, Prime Minister Kretschmann from KBW to the Greens, and many others. What is much worse, however, is that the Greens succeeded in integrating a broad extra-parliamentary movement backed into the parliamentary system and turning an anti-militarist movement against the war into the peace movement of the 1980s. A Green foreign minister, who had not been a Maoist but an operaist, Joschka Schmierer, the head of the KBW for many years, who now sat on the planning staff of the Foreign Office, led the first war mission of the Bundeswehr in 1999. In 1999. At the beginning of the 1990s, the leaders of the anti-Germans, Footnote. The anti-Germans were a political tendency in Germany that formed in the late 1980s. They referred primarily to the Frankfurt School, Adorno, etc. In their support for the state in Israel, they attacked the anti-war movement against the U.S.-led Gulf War in 1990. They denounced anyone who spoke of class politics in Germany as proto-fascist, as they regarded all non-enlightened people in Germany as right-wing anti-Semites. Okay. So, let me reread that last sentence. At the beginning of the 1990s, the leaders of the anti-Germans also came largely from Maoism. Jürgen Elsasser, former KB, even claims to have coined the term anti-German. The fact that he has meanwhile developed into a fascist is not so rare among Maoist and anti-Germans. Gedeon, the former anti-Semitic right-winger in the AfD of Baden-Württemberg, comes from the KPD-ML. In the meantime, he has been expelled from the AfD, which unfortunately is still growing. Maoism has led in some cases to this day to insurgency movements and the takeover or participation in governments in Cambodia, Zimbabwe, Peru, India, Nepal, etc. Maoism's influence within the trade union hierarchy in France, Italy, and Germany is firmly anchored. Many trade union leaders and Works Council chairmen are former Maoists. The worldwide structures of left-wing Maoists within elite universities has been briefly revealed by the Yasik case. Maoism still seems to be a viable strategy to gain power. Otherwise, the great influence of Maoism's anti-intellectual ideology in the academic milieu is difficult to explain, and already at the end of the 1960s, it was hard to explain why Maoism could bring so much misery to the worldwide youth movement. Not only in Germany, the K-groups quickly became hegemonic, but also in many other countries, the Maoists set the style and determined the debates. One reason for this was certainly the huge socialist China, which at the time was incredibly far away. Today, people like to forget that Foucault was also a Maoist at that time, one of the worst kind, gauche prolétarien. No. 10 years later, Foucault raved about, quote, the Islamic Revolution. 10 years later, Foucault raved about the, quote, Islamic Revolution in Iran. A second reason was certainly the tremendous simplicity and, quote, flexibility in thinking, as it becomes clear, for example, in the, quote, Mao Bible, the Little Red Book. This is a quote from the book. I think this might be... They say something in the footnotes about this being a translation from German as opposed to a professional English translation that they found on their own, so maybe this is a little dodgy if any Mao experts happen to be reading this. Anyway, the quote's from the Little Red Book. Quote, all reactionaries are paper tigers. Those who rest on their laurels wear them in the wrong place. Criticism should come at the right time. One must not get into the habit of criticizing only after the disaster has happened. A revolution is not a banquet, an essay writing, a picture painting, a doily. One can abolish war only by war. He who does not want the rifle must take the rifle. Dogma is worth less than a cowpat. We communists are like seeds, and the people like the soil. Fight, succumb, fight again, succumb again, fight again, and so on until victory. That is the logic of the people, and the people will never go against that logic. That is a law of Marxism, end quote. It's Mao from the Little Red Book. these are just a list of, like, I guess, extracts as opposed to a homogeneous quote. Like, there's quotes all over within this block. Quotation marks within the block quotation. These are sayings that were easy to learn by heart and used as trump cards in internal discussions. Mao's great saying from the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, quote, "Rebellion is justified," end quote, was still sprayed by the disciples of the Shining Path on every wall in Kreuzberg in the 1990s. Quote, "Consistent materialists are intrepid people who is not afraid of being quartered, dares to pull the emperor from his horse," end quote. The saying even found its way into let me reread that. Quote, "Consistent materialists are intrepid people who is not afraid of being quartered, dares to pull the emperor from his horse," end quote. The saying even found its way into a hunger strike declaration of the Red Army faction. They could certainly have found better sayings in Soldier Shewejk that were closer to reality. Even blatant lies circulated in the Mao Bible became unquestioned truths from which political strategies were developed. Quote, "Political power comes from the barrel of a gun," end quote. Quote, "Everything the enemy is fighting against, we must support. Everything the enemy supports, we must fight," end quote. Mao from the Little Red Book. A third reason for the great appeal of Maoism was that Maoism emphasized the importance of the local. Against the centralist ideas in the Soviet Union, Maoism wanted to encircle the cities from the country. This seemed to capture the dynamics of the anti-colonial movement. And on the other hand, your local practice had an immediate world historical significance. One last reason might be seen in the fact that Mao's materialism presented itself as scientific law. Quote, "In class struggle, certain classes win while others are destroyed. This is the course of history. This is the history of civilization for thousands of years. Explaining history from this point of view is called historical materialism. Taking the opposite point of view is called historical idealism," end quote. Mao. In reality, however, Mao preached unbridled voluntarism. Quote, "The will moves mountains," end quote. Everything, end quote, can be achieved with, quote, "iron discipline," end quotes. Or, see above, quote, "Consistent materialists drag the emperor from his horse," end quote. In this voluntarism, there lies a parallel to Lenin. The leading role of the party, the peasant question, the national question, the relationship of the Comintern to the national parties. At almost all of these points, Mao takes over Lenin's opportunism and intensifies it. Negri, who was very aware of this Lenin-Mao parallel, even surpassed Mao in his, quote, "lectures on Lenin" by declaring that, quote, "dialectics are a weapon of the proletariat," end quote. He thus placed himself in the tradition of both communist parties, where dialectic was a cover-up term for the fact that today one can say this and tomorrow the opposite, and only one principle is eternal. The party is always right. No wonder that dialectics have fallen into disrepute. It fucking hits the nail on the head, doesn't it? I want to reread that. Well, everyone's gonna have to suffer through. I'm rereading that bit. Or maybe not. Negri thus placed himself in the tradition of both communist parties, where, quote, "dialectic" was a cover-up term for the fact that today one can say this and tomorrow the opposite, and only one principle is eternal. The party is always right. No wonder that dialectics have fallen into disrepute. Next section. Maintained by an obscene cult leader. In the People's Republic of China, founded in 1949, a bureaucratic class developed very quickly. As early as 1955, these cadres consumed almost 10% of the state budget. The Communist Party of China had planned a ceiling of 5%. By the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, this proportion had grown to 30%. The various campaigns of Mao, quote, "let 100 flowers bloom," end quote, quote, "the Great Leap Forward," and quote, "the Cultural Revolution," can all be read as an attempt, on the one hand, to repeatedly impose the political leadership of the CCP on this layer of bureaucrats, and on the other hand, to use this layer to keep the people under control and exploit them. In parentheses, Mao has no class analysis, but rather divides the population quite arbitrarily into about 50 classes that decide on access to resources. Into parentheses. During these campaigns and various additional mobilizations, Mao and his entourage repeatedly gave out target figures. For example, 5% of the population were reactionary and therefore to be eliminated. Is that a quote? I don't know. For example, 5% of the population were, quote, reactionary and therefore to, quote, be eliminated, end quote. Such policies could affect as much as 15% of the population that needed to be, quote, disciplined or, quote, controlled or, quote, rendered harmless. A great role was also played by the millions of people who were sent into sheer misery in the countryside, where even the 12 hours of daily hard work they were not able to sustain themselves. The, quote, Great Leap Forward at the end of the 1950s had brought about one of the greatest famines in the history of mankind, with 15 to 45 million dead. Felix Wemheuer reckons 30 to 40 million. The campaign of the Great Leap Forward was stopped in 1961. 5 years later, Mao launched the next campaign and triggered a civil war with the, quote, Cultural Revolution, whose repression by the military, also ordered by him, again cost more than 1 million dead. In his book, China Under Mao, A Revolution Derailed, of 2015, Andrew G. Walder estimates that between 1.5 and 1.8 million people died. He puts the number of victims of direct persecution. 5 years later, Mao launched the next campaign and triggered a civil war with the Cultural Revolution, whose repression by the military, also ordered by him, again cost more than 1 million dead. In his book, China Under Mao, A Revolution Derailed, of 2015, Andrew G. Walder estimates that between 1.5 and 1.8 million people died in the Cultural Revolution. He puts the number of victims of direct persecution at 22 to 30 million, and those indirectly affected by persecution at 106 to 150 million. Quote, most of the victims were neither the Red Guards in 1966 nor the armed faction fights in 1967. Most people were killed in 1968 and 1969 when the army carried out, quote, purge campaigns from above after the restoration of order, end quote. Felix Wemheuer, The Western European Left and the Chinese Cultural Revolution in Politics and Contemporary History, 66 volume 23 of 2016. Next section. And brutal population policies. The CCP is a campaign party that repeatedly combines mass mobilization and violence. Since the CCP came to power in 1949, it has resorted to these means in all crisis situations. Within a very short time, the party headquarters can switch to crisis mode, pushing aside the bureaucratic rules and apparatuses and sending huge shock waves through the entire system that make resistance near to impossible. Though collective disciplinary measures such as during the corona epidemic are the natural playing field for the CP, this kind of emergency mobilization is in the CP's RNA. Currently, 1/10 of the Uyghurs, I think that's how you pronounce it, Uyghurs, the group that's in the re-education camps. Currently, 1/10 of the Uyghurs are in re-education camps. These are normal dimensions in Chinese domestic politics since Mao's time. It works less from a policing point of view than with the fear that these camps, or, in the past, the land deportations, cause among the rest of the population. The CCP is an extremely successful machine in, quote, moving huge masses of people. After the, quote, Great Leap experiment had to be abandoned in 1961, 20 to 25 million industrial workers were dismissed and sent to the countryside within 2 years. As a result, these 20 to 25 million industrial workers lost their valuable urban residence status. In this context, Mao spoke proudly of the power and efficiency of the Chinese Communist state in the comprehensive restructuring of labor. Quote, 20 million people can be rounded up from 1 minute to the next and dismissed again with a simple show of hands. If the Communist Party were not in power, who would be able to accomplish such an achievement? End quote. This quote can be found on page 148 in the German translation of the book The Cultural Revolution at the Margins, published by Mandelbaum Publishing House in 2019. It was published in the English original in 2014, The Cultural Revolution at the Margins. We will discuss the book in the next Wildcat. In the second and especially the third phase of the Cultural Revolution, large sections of the Chinese working class turned Mao's call for rebellion and rebelled against precisely these forms of population policies. Land deportation, mass layoffs, temporary employment. More of this in the next issue. P.S. The history of Maoism is also marked by fierce internal struggles and mutual slaughter. The Yasuk campaign is no exception. Several protagonists behave like real assholes, both in their own organization and toward supporters. Pan Ngai, for example, has deceived and burned out some of her employees. Probably not for the first time. And after the left-wing Maoists of Utopia and Red China had initially supported the campaign with publicity, they then switched back to the state line in early 2019 and lured some Yasuk left-wing Maoists into a trap and betrayed them to the police. The, quote, cultural revolutionary attempt against the establishment of the CP probably failed for the time being.